watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
And welcome to the show, everybody. Your host, Michael, on a Saturday afternoon. Really excited. We're going to be discussing primacy, conciliarity, and Catholic and Orthodox unity, joined by esteemed guest, Dr. Petros Vassiliadis, Professor, Emeritus Professor, and Director of the Postgraduate Program in Orthodox Ecumenical Theology of the University of St. Catherine, along with a very long litany of impressive credentials. Professor, welcome to the show. How are you?
I am fine, and I am very grateful for this opportunity to be with you.
It's an honor to have you on. It really is. And I'm really excited about this topic. It's really important for me to have more focus on Catholic and Orthodox unity. So I think that this is going to be a really good show. But before we dive into the topic at hand, tell us just a little bit about yourself and your background with Catholics and Orthodoxy when it comes to unity. I know you did some work on the Synoptic Gospels in the Q document, I believe, in your dissertation, but you also have ecumenical discussions. So yeah, if you could briefly talk about your background there.
Well, in addition to my primary profession, which is biblical theology, I have been working since the time of my retirement on the ecumenical reconciliation, and I was and I am still the president in honor of the Center of Ecumenical, Missiological, and Environmental Studies, named after a great ecumenist of the past. Very rare figures to be honest, Metropolitan Panteleimon Papageorgiou of Thessaloniki back in the 60s. So we dedicated this foundation to this ecumenical reconciliation. And by the way, I am running also as a director, as you said, of an inter-Orthodox and inter-jurisdictional, and I would say also ecumenical master program in Orthodox Ecumenical Theology. By Orthodox meaning not only the so-called confessional, in the confessional sense, but also in the authentic Christian tradition. So this year, actually this academic year, in addition to this program, we have set up in collaboration with the university, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelicum, a series of open public lectures on the theme, the unity of the one Church of Christ. So today's discussion with you on primacy and conciliarity concerns also our students and our friends, both in the Catholic and in the Orthodox tradition, about this, which is launched actually after the initiative taken by Pope Francis to revive reconciliarity. So this is my short introduction and my present occupation.
Excellent. And yeah, you know, I was looking at some of your papers online. In fact, I have one of them linked in the show notes if anybody is interested in checking it out. But I was especially curious about the paper that you wrote, Conciliarity and Primacy from the New Testament to the Present, Orthodox Catholic Theological Dialogue. And so I want to dive into this. You know, when we speak about the concepts of conciliarity and primacy, how would you say we should define these terms in an ecclesiastical context, or is that part of the problem? Is there a difficulty there?
Yeah, okay. Conciliarity and primacy are two important aspects of Christian ecclesiology, not only in the Orthodox ecclesiology, but also in the Christian in general. The concept of conciliarity is understood both in the broader sense of the term, in other words, inclusiveness, participation, universal consultation on theological and practical aspects of the church life, etc., but also in its narrow meaning, namely that of the order of ecclesiastical administration. So conciliarity, in other words, is more or less an expression of the church's charismatic nature. By the same logic, the concept of primacy, for centuries now, mainly in the Protestant theology, but in the recent past also in a major part of the modern Orthodox theology, is associated only with the institutional expression of the church. Nevertheless, it is to be found, the conciliarity and primacy, especially primacy, is to be found both in the New Testament and in patristic theology of the undivided church, where it acquires not only a canonical status, but also a theological foundation. So this is, in general, what conciliarity and primacy are all about.
Yeah. Now, these two concepts of conciliarity and primacy, would you say that they necessarily contradict one another or not exactly?
Yeah, at the first glance, yes, it is. It seems to be contradictory, but to be honest, this seemingly contradiction of the two important aspects, as I said, of Christian ecclesiology, was due to an earlier exposition in almost all traditional doctrinal manuals of academic theology, including the Orthodox, where, and this was mainly based on a more or less scholastic understanding of the past dogmatic theology, in which ecclesiology, erroneously of course, starts with a definition which generally describes the church exclusively as a divine institution of the earthly society. Now, institution is the so-called institutional aspect. However, of the earthly society of believers, which indicates the so-called conciliar dimension, which has its origin, of course, in Jesus Christ and his apostles, who delegated their authority to the bishops. And most theologians in the past tried to reconcile these two seemingly contradicting, but in fact, not at all terms.
Now, another thing that you touch on in your paper is Eucharistic Ecclesiology. And in fact, we hear a whole lot about this in light of figures like Zizoulas and others. Could you tell us a little bit about what exactly is Eucharistic Ecclesiology?
First of all, let me explain that the official theological dialogue between Catholics and Orthodox is based on Eucharistic ecclesiology. They have for many, many years studied the essence of the Eucharistic event, and the instrument was Eucharistic ecclesiology, the theological approach. Now, one of the cornerstones of Eucharistic ecclesiology, first expounded by Nicholas Afanasiev just before the Second Vatican Council, was the priority of the horizontal ecclesiological and eschatological perspective, evidenced both in the New Testament and the early church, with the vertical soteriological one placed always within the framework of this horizontal eschatological as a complementary, not as contradictory or a different one. As a result, the Eucharistic ecclesiology, through this Eucharistic ecclesiology, we have discovered the foundational, yet marginalized for many centuries, incarnational Christian doctrine. And this inevitably led us to the overcoming the traditional, later patristic exclusivity, not only Greek, but also Latin. Each side tried to rely only on their patristic interpretation of their experience of the first millennium. Now, with the ensuing, of course, from on both sides, mostly from the Orthodox sides, an anti-ecumenist and anti-Western, on our part, attitude. There are three characteristics, to be honest, of our modern Orthodox theology: the hesychastic one, the Trinitarian one, and the Eucharistic one. All these three theologies are experienced and are present in the present theological debate. There is no doubt that Trinitarian approach seems to be the prevailing among almost all Christians in recent time. In the point, all important theological contributions have as a starting point the Trinitarian theology. Now, without undermining this legitimacy, the legitimacy of the Trinitarian theology, I insist in approaching all issues, and this is what the official theological dialogue between Orthodox and Catholics has done, from the Eucharistic perspective. It is my firm conviction that out of these three main characteristics, only the Eucharistic one can bear a universal and ecumenical significance. If the hesychastic dimension and important feature of the Eastern tradition marks a decisive development in Eastern Christian theology and spirituality after the eventual, not schism, but separation between East and West, between the old Rome and the new Rome, and if the Trinitarian dimension constitutes the supreme expression of Christian theology ever produced by human thought in its attempt to grasp the mystery of God, of divinity, what is God? Is it one, or is a communion, and so on and so on? After Christianity's dynamic encounter with the Greek culture, it was nevertheless only because of the Eucharistic experience in the early stages of Christian life, the matrix of all theology and spirituality of the Church, that all theological and spiritual climaxes in Christian theology have been actually achieved. So the Eucharistic Ecclesiology and the Eucharistic approach is the primary theological element from which we have to start. And it is my firm personal conviction that out of these three main characteristics, only the Eucharistic one, as I said, bear a universal and ecumenical significance. So this is what we can say about Eucharistic ecclesiology as it is developed also in, as I said, the official theological dialogue between Catholic and Orthodox Church.
Now, another thing you touch on in your paper relates to the identity of the church, and you situate it in the context of the Eucharist. So could you tell us a little bit about how exactly does the Eucharist determine the essay or the identity of the church?
Yeah, if any conclusion is to be drawn from what I have referred to earlier, to the Eucharistic Ecclesiology, of course, the reference to the Eucharistic Ecclesiology, this is an affirmation of the ecclesial and diaconal dimension of the Eucharist as a communion event and not as an act of personal devotion, an act of diaconia and sharing, and not a sacramentalistic or quasi-magical rite, and an expression of the Church as the people of God, laos του Θεού, and the household of God, oikos του Θεού. And finally, as it is known from the Bible, the body of Christ mystically united with its head, and not a mere cultic institution. So the Eucharist is the identity element of our church only in this perspective. In other words, the Eucharist as the unique and primal mystery of the Church is a reflection of the communion that exists between the persons of the Holy Trinity. And this is what is expressed clearly in the Bible. As I am with you, Father, Jesus Christ said, so my disciples should be united. And this is somewhere the essence of the mystery of the Church as a reflection of the communion that exists between the persons of the Holy Trinity. And above all, the Eucharist is, as the Greek word says, a thanksgiving and Eucharistia, a thanksgiving prayer to God for the unity of mankind and a proleptic manifestation of the kingdom to come. So it has also the eschatological dimension, which is very important to understand that the Church is not only an earthly institution, an institution like all the institutions in this world, but also it has a reference to the kingdom which is to come. It is almost an assured result, at least of modern theological scholarship, not only my professional, biblical, but also in the liturgical scholarship, that the Eucharist was lived and experienced in the early church community, Christian community, not as a mystery cult, because there were many mystery cults those days, but as a foretaste of the anticipated kingdom of God. As I said, a manifestation, as a proleptic manifestation within the tragic realities of history, of an authentic life of communion, of unity, of justice, of equality, with no practical differentiation, soteriological and beyond, between Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free people, men and women, according to the famous passage of the Epistle of St. Paul to the Galatians. This was, after all, the real meaning of the Johannine term aionios zoe, the eternal life. And of course, the meaning of the misunderstood by some people of St. Ignatius' expression, medicine of immortality, the pharmakon athanasias. It is not that we will become immortal, but it is because of this communion event and the anticipation of the kingdom to come, we experience the real authentic life. This is why the Eucharist is considered the essence, the identity actually of our church, of the ecclesiology. Ecclesiology cannot be dissociated from the mystery par excellence of the church, namely the Eucharist.
Excellent. Now, walk us through a little bit more how the Eucharist impacts discussions on conciliarity and primacy.
Now, so far, as I said, the Orthodox Catholic theological dialogue has correctly focused on the mystery of the Church, namely the Eucharist. The theological dialogue between these two major parts of the traditional Christianity has been correctly based on, as I said, the Eucharistic Ecclesiology, having this kind of theology as an instrument to approach the Eucharistic union. The problem is how deeply in our biblical foundation this Eucharistic ecclesiology can be formulated. And this is what I tried from my professional perspective to do in regard to promoting this kind of rapprochement between East and West. In the early stages of Christianity, the Church functioned as a corporate entity, a real body of Christ where primacy and conciliarity were linked together. And all top theologians, as we know, were bishops, and vice versa. All bishops were top theologians. and those of profound theological knowledge, even deacons like St. Athanasius, played a decisive role in the conciliar process of the Church. Gradually, however, for many reasons, all the canonical decisions were taken without a real conciliar process, a real consensus by the entire Christian community, and in some cases without an in-depth theological examination or scholarly expertise. This is not the case. This was not the case in the early church. As I said, all bishops were top theologians, and they had scrutinized before formulating a dogma. The third millennium, which we have entered now, with the enormous scientific and technological development, sooner or later will increase the horizon of the conciliar process, and the Church will widen the area of consensus in its proper authentic use. And this is why Pope Francis envisaged this reality and was ready to include at least all academic and theological resources, all lay people, men and women, in this conciliar process. It is a lengthy process, 2 years it will last, and we are expecting eagerly the results of this. And his initiative to start this lengthy conciliar process in the Catholic Church is something which also the Orthodox sister church, my church, will benefit because it will alert us for the profound meaning of our Orthodox ecclesiological identity. Previously, we thought that the Catholic Church places more emphasis on primacy, whereas the Orthodox more on conciliarity. Now this is reversed. However, we need a new understanding of primacy, which is now discussed, and we will speak about this if there is time later.
Yeah, that last part is a really good observation. So, you know, looking through the paper, there was a part that really jumped out at me, and that was where you discuss open fellowship and inclusive theology. So can you maybe speak about open fellowship and inclusive theology and how we observe this in the New Testament era?
Yeah, this is the biblical foundation of this issue, of this ecclesiological issue, the perennial issue, which is also, as I said, very important in the present day Orthodox Catholic theological dialogue, is what we have recently discovered in the New Testament scholarship. The open fellowship and the inclusive theology most widely developed by St. Paul. We can thus better understand the profound meaning of the Eucharistic Ecclesiology and what the Eucharist is all about. Actually, the biblical foundation of the Eucharistic Ecclesiology is to be connected, at least, with the Apostolic Council. However, the real cause of the convocation of the Apostolic Council was the famous Antioch incident, which is described in the second chapter of the Epistle to the Galatians. There, the actual dispute was the Eucharistic inclusiveness. In other words, whether a prerequisite in sharing the Eucharistic or Messianic or eschatological meal were to be conditioned by the Old Testament regulations, circumcision, cleanness, dietary rules, etc. Now, let me remind our listeners, at least, that in the Epistle to the Galatians, St. Paul defended St. Peter's dining with the Gentiles. These are the actual words, meta ton ethnon synisthie. Peter, before the coming of the people of St. James, in fact, members of the Pharisaic sect, as we know from the book of Acts, St. Peter was easily sitting with the Gentiles. Now, for Paul, an open table fellowship and the absence of boundaries at meals, as there were boundaries in the contemporary Judaism, are characteristic and distinctive of the social self-understanding that Jesus himself encouraged his disciples to do. Paul, in fact, followed the example of the historical Jesus, who in numerous cases challenged the social and religious validity of some Torah regulations on clean and unclean. Most of his healings and miracles were directed towards people who were considered, according to their views at those days, unclean. They were lepers, it was a woman in bloodshed, people possessed by demons, blind, crippled, etc. Whereas for the Jews of his days, the most important issue was how and on what conditions can people approach God in order to be saved, of course. Jesus and the early church thereafter reversed this soteriological axiom, putting more emphasis on how God himself approaches people and offers salvation. So the grace of God was primary to the good deeds of the people. To the former, to the Jews, approaching God was accomplished only through the law. In many cases, St. Paul says, en to nomo. Whereas to Jesus, and later to his church, through Christ and Christo, or en pneumati in other cases. So the issue of inclusion within the community of faith of all people, clean and unclean, one can extend now in today's terms, mutatis mutandis, of course, also faithful and those either considered schismatic or heretics, and therefore accepting them all at the common Eucharistic meals received quite dangerous consequences for the emerging new Christian religion at the first century, of course, once it expanded beyond the boundaries of Judaism. Of course, receiving new converts was not a problem throughout the early church. Even Judeo-Christians could accept and endorse it. The problem arose on the practical consequence of such a move at the common Eucharistic meals between circumcised Jews and former and uncircumcised Gentiles. So that major theological problem has become ever since the model of the ecumenical councils, as well as of the so-called conciliar process. Despite the compromise, of course, adopted at the Apostolic Council in order to give some to convince the more conservative of Jewish origin, the church up to the Constantinian era was an open society for all who believed in Christ, with open table fellowship and with unconditional participation in all Eucharistic meals.
So, in light of your studies, What would you say is the best solution, moving forward for reconciliation between Catholics and Orthodox, especially when it concerns matters of ecclesiology?
Of course, from my studies, both in the biblical discipline and also in the in modern ecumenical theology, I came to the conclusion that the official Catholic Orthodox dialogue could have come to the desired conclusion, even to the point of a Eucharistic communion, had the Russian Orthodox Church not rejected the primacy. You see, we spoke too much about conciliarity so far, but the issue of importance is a concept accepted by both Orthodox and Catholics, the issue of primacy. An issue which in a united Christianity can be the solution to the problem, at least of the division between old and new Rome. Not so much against the Russians were not so much against the Catholic Church's tradition as against the primacy exercised in the Orthodox Church during the entire second millennium by the ecumenical patriarch. According to the ecumenical councils, the primacy of the Bishop of Rome was uncontested, but equal to the Bishop of Rome, also after him, the Bishop of New Rome was having equal rights. So after the so-called division, the separation between Old and New Rome, the primacy was, according to the tradition, exercised by the Bishop of the New Rome of Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarch. The most serious theological issue at stake for our Orthodox witness is a diaconal primacy. The refusal within contemporary Orthodoxy to accept a church with a visible head, like the Catholic Church has a visible head of their unity, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. In other words, in our terminology, a protos, not in jurisdictional, but in terms of a humble diaconia. If we don't have this, we destroy the basis of our church unity. The imperative necessity of having a primus as a at a universal level, in view of the existence of a primacy in all other levels, in Metropolitan, in Episcopal, in Paris, even in Paris, we have someone who is leading the community, either the Metropolitan at a general, a wider diocese, or an Episcopal, a smaller diocese, or in a parish. So this deprives a coherence in the Orthodox Church's witness. Of course, any novel, because there were also proposed some novel perceptions of church unity based primarily on power, arithmetic, or superiority, and so on, which is currently promoted or even viewed by the Patriarchate of Moscow on the basis of Moscow being today the capital of a currently dominant empire, as previously was the case of the Ecumenical Patriarchate at the city of the New Rome, which was, as we know, the capital of the Roman Empire. This can hardly, however, have any ecclesiological and canonical justification. The new situation in Ukraine, with the granting of autocephaly to the Orthodox in that country, unexpectedly brought also a wider ecumenical revival. And ironically enough, with the contribution of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic community in religious reconciliation in Ukraine, but also with their openly expressed views in favor of Ukrainian autocephaly. For nearly half a millennium, a problem in the Ukrainian-Russian history was the Uniatism. Now, this ecclesiastical structure within the Catholic Church has suddenly emerged as one of the main players in fostering ecumenical relations, the way even the famous Balamant Declaration, which happened some 30, 40 years ago, in an attempt to promote the dialogue and solve a little bit this problem. The Balamant Declaration has not succeeded as the Greek, the Orthodox Catholic dialogue, as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic has done, or at least have assisted. Now, in addition to their signing in 2014 a memorandum of a single and unified Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, hoping, of course, that sometime all the churches can be united in that country, following the announcement of the Ecumenical Patriarchate's determination to grant autocephaly. In a survey under the title, What the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church can teach each other, the Ukrainian Greek Catholics did not hesitate to answer, and I quote, broad participation in church government. This is something that has been now looked for by the initiative of Pope Francis. Something, they continue, so important in the, as I said, venerable Orthodox tradition. And after the Ecumenical Patriarch invited ordinary clergy and laity, in addition to bishops, to the December 15, 2018 Unification Council, the Greek Catholics declared, without neglecting the conciliar tradition of the Catholic Church, because they belong to the Catholic Church, the Greek Catholic Ukrainian Church can also learn from the strong Orthodox tradition of synodality and lay participation. This applies not only to the conduct of major councils, but to the election of bishops and priests. And I would now add also to the entire ecclesiastical life, the liturgical one included, from parish to the universal expression of it. Now, His Beatitude, Monsignor Sviatoslav Shevchuk, underlined that, and I quote again, in Ukraine there is an interesting perspective for ecumenical dialogue in the context of new possibilities. And in an interview, he went on as far as expressing a bold, optimistic view that, and I quote again, the restoration of Eucharistic communion between Rome and Constantinople is not utopian thinking, as some people call it. This is the goal of the ecumenical movement. This is the fulfillment of the commandment of Christ that all may be one. And let me conclude, this very brief presentation to your kind question. The Orthodox should, we Orthodox should revive our witness to the entire world, both within and outside our canonical boundaries, on the basis of an authentic, inclusive ecclesiology and with its principal expression of unity and especially Catholicity, manifested in the Bible, and we know that we may all be one, in our creed, because we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, but also in our liturgical tradition, where we unceasingly pray for the union of all. And we should, in addition, abandon our ideological understanding of Orthodoxy, which is believe only on the right doctrine, and we mostly use this traditionally not ecclesiologically and theologically, but against the Western use of Catholic as their identity mark. And fortunately, the Holy and Great Council has declared that the Church does not exist for herself, but for the world. So this is something which marks a new era in our Orthodox tradition.
You spoke there about the Holy and Great Council. Let's talk just briefly about the Pan-Orthodox Council. Well, some might dispute that term, but the Council of Crete in 2016, the Holy and Great Council, it was in preparation for arguably 100 or 50 years, just depending on how you date it. I noticed that you had a paper on your academia, which I'll put in the show notes here in a minute, but I noticed you had a paper going over an assessment of the council. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about it? What exactly was it, and how do you think that it went?
Now, the Pan-Orthodox Council, because it was prepared to be an expression of the unity of the Orthodox. Unfortunately, because of the decision, for various reasons, it's not time to discuss it, of 4 autocephalous churches to abstain at the last moment, despite the fact that all Orthodox churches have signed the pre-conciliar documents, be discussed and just voted for. That was all. Despite this, following the example of the terminology of the famous First Ecumenical Council, which was called Holy and Great by the subsequent ecclesiastical tradition, they decided to give this name, Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church. Now, what has been decided, not only in view of the unanimous preparation of all documents that have been agreed unanimously to be brought for discussion in Crete, all the decisions, in my view, are binding to all Orthodox churches. 2 documents were most important, and they have received some concerns by those churches that have abstained. The ecclesiological document, the relations of the Orthodox Church with the other Christian churches, the term church was discussed hours and hours, because some very conservatives wouldn't like to give this title even to the Catholic Church. Fortunately, they have made a decision at least to find a compromise, and we have this. But the most, the other document, which was the so-called mission document, the mission of the Church to today's world, was the one that has met with the most reactions, official reactions, by the Russian Orthodox Church. And we understand why. And we have seen this because they have a different idea what is the mission, the witness of the Church. They think, and they have shown, endorsing this barbarous invasion of the Russian Federation into Ukraine, because they think that they have a divided world, the Orthodox who are on the good side, and all the Western which are corrupted, including sometimes the Catholic Church or the Protestant churches, sometimes even including those more open to ecumenism, like the Ecumenical Patriarchy, the Church of Greece, the Patriarchate of Alexandria, even the Patriarchate of Antioch. So they think that they were purposely, the Russian Church didn't come to the Holy and Great Council in Crete. In addition to their refusal to accept or to endorse by their presence that someone has to preside over, without having the let's say the final word on the decisions, but just to preside. This would mean that their view, their dream, their vision to conquer the Orthodox world and sometimes become, as they say, with the Catholic Church in the dialogue, in the unofficial dialogue or in the discussion with the Catholic Church, with the Vatican, they say we are the most numerous churches and we can agree to go together. So this is not ecclesiological approach, but rather a secular approach. So this is my understanding. In addition, we cannot, and Patriarch Bartholomew said this, we have not solved in the Holy in Crete all the problems, but we have made a start, and we are now at the stage of continuing the work that we have started with the Holy and Great Council in Crete.
I seem to recall something in the document where it spoke of having these councils more often. Do you think that there's going to be another Holy and Great Council anytime soon? Or
it was agreed, not officially in a document, that we have. It was proposed by the Romanian Orthodox Church, also by the others, that we have started a process that we have not experienced since the first millennium. The Catholic Church had, fortunately, now they are called general councils. Previously, they were called ecumenical councils, but now the Catholics realize that to be an ecumenical, we have to at least include also the Eastern sister churches. Now, we have this kind of an initiative, a beginning, and we have at least every 10 years to follow what the present ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew started with a semi-ecumenical institution, which was the synaxis, the meeting of the primates of Orthodox churches, representing their churches and at least giving a word of hope to the world. That was the first step towards the Holy and Great Council. The Holy and Great Council, fortunately, was convened, finalized its work. The decisions are, in my view, as I said, binding to the Eastern Orthodoxy, but the whole work has not been finalized.
There's a question
hopefully,
here.
The next Holy and Great Council to be together with the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope Francis and the Patriarch Bartholomew have envisioned that in celebrating the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea, in 3 years, we should solve at least and meet together, and at least we solve the problem of the common celebration of Pascha, of Easter. This
Yeah,
is
at
another
the very
problem.
least.
We have worked in our foundation last year, because last year we celebrated not according to the decision of the First Ecumenical Council, our Easter,
Mhm.
not in the first Sunday after the full moon, but in the fifth Sunday, not after the first full moon, but after the second full moon, because of this regulation with the old calendar, the Julian.
Mhm.
Some
Mhm.
people, I mean, being anti-Western,
Mhm.
they don't like a calendar with the name of a pope, but at the same time they rely on a calendar of a Gentile, of an emperor, of the Roman Empire, of a non-Christian.
Yeah. That's a really good point there. There's a question here from the audience. So, what do you think that reunion between East and West would cause, or do you think that reunion between East and West would cause a schism in Orthodoxy?
This is the main problem um, of our Eastern Orthodox tradition, because for many centuries, I would say through the second millennium, we have developed a negative identity. We are not what the Bible and our tradition has left us as a legacy,
Mm.
but what the others are not. First, without paying attention to the Word of God, to the Bible, because the Protestants rely on the Bible only, the
Mm.
sola scriptura, and against the Catholic Church, because they have the primacy of Pope. So these are issues that we have to educate our faithful, that this is not outside our tradition, but we need to take away this kind of negative identity and try to find what the official theological dialogue, and I'm sure that the official theological dialogue would have been finalized if we have solved the second part, because all these years they were working on how primacy was exercised in the first millennium,
Mhm.
leaving out what the primacy was exercised and should be exercised in the second and in the third millennium. And also another issue which is very important, and that's why I said the role that the Greek Catholics, the Eastern Catholics can play, is very important in bringing not only the Catholics closer, as they have done since the Second Vatican, to the Orthodox, but also the Orthodox closer to the um, the, the 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 importance of Catholicity,
Mm.
which is so much revered in the Western tradition, whereas in the Orthodox tradition, as I said, we pay more attention to the right doctrine, to the orthodoxia or theodoxa, whereas the Catholic Church is, even by the name, pays more attention to the Catholicity, to the
Yeah.
unity of the Church. This is what we are missing, whereas the Western Church is missing the kind of conciliarity we were supposed to have, and they are trying now to rediscover. And after after the completion of this conciliar process of the Catholic Church, I hope
Mm.
it will be much. I mean, even another obstacle between the relations between Orthodox and Catholics removed.
Well said. This is from Roberto. What would make Orthodox churches more open to allowing Catholics to receive communion? Also, would allowing Catholics to receive communion work in favor towards ending division?
Um, the problem, as I said, of an open table fellowship is a personal biblical, let's say, understanding. However, we in the Orthodox Church, we have not reached the way after Vatican II the Catholics have done, acknowledging the sacraments, all the major sacraments of the Eastern Orthodox Church. If we can discuss properly after this dialogue with the official dialogue, because having discussed the Eucharist, we have reached almost the conclusion that we cannot but accept the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. We have a tradition that if a Roman Catholic was received to the Orthodox Church, could not be rebaptized. Sometimes we were accepted also in the priestly orders they had. But officially, this is not the case. The mixed marriages, however, have developed a new window towards a more ecumenical approach of the Orthodox towards the Catholics. So, although I am in favor of the Eucharist being the final goal of church unity, not a means towards the unity, in some cases, a so-called intercommunion or a Eucharistic fellowship can be exercised the way at least was exercised during the persecution period in the Soviet Union in the past, in Albania. I remember Patriarch Archbishop Anastasios of Albania was saying that during the persecution we were united, we were praying together, even with the Muslims. And now after we have been liberated, we have been departed from each other. So these are some signs. And in the Middle East, believe it or not, there was not a canonical and ecclesiological schism between the Church of Rome and the Church of Constantinople. There were not excommunication of the churches or anathemas of the churches. That's why it was easily lifted by Patriarch Athenagoras and Pope Paul VI, because there was not a canonical. There were cases, especially in the Middle East, even up to the 17th century, that they didn't know that there was not communion between Constantinople and Rome.
Right.
Using priests for both communities, Catholic and Orthodox.
Yeah, we've had Callistus Ware on the show, and I remember he wrote a really good article on communicatio in sacris between Catholics and Orthodox well into the middle of the 18th century. Yeah, fascinating discussion there. So traditional gentleman asks, do you think the schism between Catholics and Orthodox is going to be healed by 2040, or do you think reunion will take place hundreds of years from now?
How?
Hundreds of years from now, or by 2040?
I am optimistic because the world moves faster than the churches, like traditional institutions. However, there is not, as I said, a schism. There is an estrangement between East and West, which can be solved, especially, and I pray that between these two heads of the Eastern and Western Christianity, the situation is much more prosperous because they are dedicated towards the reunion of the one Church of Christ. However, we understand that there is a lot of work that has to be done, not so much in the Western tradition, because I know that there were also reactions by the so-called traditionalist Catholics. Some of them are even against the initiatives of Pope Francis.
Yeah.
But more reactions are from those uneducated, untheological sources and quarters of the Eastern Orthodox Church. That is why we expected that only through coming together in a synodical process, that is why we had more expectations from the Holy and Great Council, from the Pan-Orthodox, because in these occasions there are theologians, bishops, archbishops, patriarchs, who can convince those who have some reservations. So in a way, those who deny the so-called conciliar process in the Orthodox Church, they do it because they are afraid of losing their exclusivity, that they are the only one that can be saved and should be saved without having any concern about what the rest of the world, the rest of the Christians will do.
Could you maybe briefly comment on reconciliation between the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox? Is there is this close or not really?
The Eastern Oriental Orthodox dialogue has reached a perfect conclusion. And this is the tragic, that despite the finalization of the official theological dialogue, no further step has been taken. I remember the former Patriarch of Alexandria, who was saying, if we are united with the Copts, we can surrender and they will be the Patriarch of Alexandria. We don't have any such a problem. The problem is that the anathemas are not lifted between the anathemas in the 15th century between the so-called Oriental Orthodox churches and the Eastern churches, despite the fact that the official dialogue delegated the next step to see how these anathemas can be lifted and how the acknowledgement of the Oriental Orthodox churches of the fourth, all the seven ecumenical councils, because they realized the decision is that it was a misunderstanding in terms. We had the same pneumatology, the same spirituality, the same theology. It was a difficult understanding because of the language problem. However, the Oriental Orthodox Church seemed to accept indirectly the three remaining ecumenical councils and the fourth ecumenical councils, because they refused the Chalcedon, the council in Chalcedon. So also the following councils actually are not accepted, but accepting the theology between Eastern and Orientals, they said that we can go as far as indirectly accepting the rest of the ecumenical councils of the Eastern and Western Orthodox Church, or Eastern Orthodox and Catholic Western Church. So it is a problem because the dialogue has finished with very good results and not the next step was taken.
Yeah. Professor, I want to thank you so much for coming on and doing this. I'd love to have you back on and talk about other discussions, maybe related to Ukraine or Eastern Catholicism and your perspective on them. I'd love to hear more. So like I said, you're welcome back on the show anytime.
Thank you very much for inviting me in this first, and we hope we have another occasion to discuss with you.
And I'll put a link to your academia page. Is there anything else that you want to make the viewers aware of where they could go to find out more about you?
It's academia. I use only the Academia Edu plus Petros Vassiliadis.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll put that in there as well.
I have put all my works in accessible to the public.
Yeah, and I see a handful of these are in English, so very, very accessible. So I look forward to reading more and talking to you again in the future. Thanks so much for coming on.
I thank you too.
And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support us. We'll see you later. God bless.
Hey, RNT fans, if you're looking to buy a home or sell a home and would like a realtor who shares your beliefs, be sure to check out our sponsor, realestateforlife.org, and be sure